Welcome back to another beautiful day in Western Asia. So today we will be looking at the very start of the Achaemenid Empire. So this is really, as I said in the last lecture, that the Achaemenid Empire really is the first world empire. And they ruled from around 550 BCE all the way to 332 BCE, which is the time when Alexander the Great, Alexander of Macedon, came and completely wiped out the entirety of the Achaemenid Empire. But before we get into learning about these lovely Achaemenids, we have to speak about our midterm, the second midterm, and this is on April 6th. So it may be just as surprising to you as it was to me. So a new format, obviously. We're not going to be meeting in person because, well, that is physically impossible now. But the basis is here. So number one is two matching questions. And these are, you're going to have 3 minutes per question for this. And these are going to be based on site plans. So make sure you know the site plans. Those are those black and white things that show the footprints of buildings. Make sure you know those from everything that we've talked about from the first lecture after the last midterm all the way up to what we talk about next week. The next is 8 short answer questions. So these are going to be drawn from the study questions that are on the study guide that will be posted as soon as this lecture is posted. And they're going to be relatively based on these study questions. So these are going to be very similar to what you wrote for your attendance assignment. It's going to be a short question that you're going to answer just a few sentences to. And this is in lieu of the slide identifications. As you'll see on the study guide, that there are still object identifications, so still things to look at because these are things that you're going to be expected to know and expected to be able to talk about for these short answer questions. And of course, we have the 3 essays. This is exactly the same as last time. It'll be a compare and contrast. So it's exactly the same as what we did before. The test will open at 9:45 a.m. Forgot to put a.m. on there. I apologize. And it will close at 11:59 p.m. on April 6th. So you'll have basically the entire day to work on the exam, and you have 2.5 hours to complete the exam. As you'll see, if you add up all of the expected minutes per question, it adds up to the hour and 15 minutes, just like a normal exam that we would take in the class. But you have 2.5 hours. So once you open the exam, it will automatically close and submit your answers after 2.5 hours. So if you don't finish in time, which you definitely should, these questions are not meant to make you take the entire 2.5 hours. But if you, for some reason, don't, or you open it up and then come back to it later, it will lock you out. So make sure that you have the time to be able to sit down and take the whole test as if it were an hour and 15 minutes long. Now, I trust you all to not look at your notes or cheat. We're not going to do the lockdown browser thing. So this is the honor system. So please don't cheat or look things up. We will know if it's obviously flagrant and blatant, but this is the honor system. So I'm trusting you to not look at your notes or anything like that, and you can trust me to grade you fairly. Now, for those of you who have a DRC letter, add the appropriate amount of time to the hour and 15 minutes, just like a normal test and just like you did with the previous test. So we understand the challenges that we're all facing by going online and doing an online test. My advice is to study hard, and you will do just fine. And of course, if you have any other questions about the exam, don't hesitate to email me, and I will help you out there. So, getting to the Achaemenids, a little bit of review. It was founded by Cyrus the Great, who ruled approximately from 600 to 529 BCE. It was greatly expanded by Darius I and his son Xerxes I. And according to Darius, he ruled from the Sakai beyond Sogdia to Nubia, and from India to Lydia. So the four corners of the empire. And of course, as I said, it was destroyed by Alexander the Great in 331, 332 BCE. Of course, it's when do you decide is the final this empire was destroyed? So sometime between 332 331 is when the Achaemenids fully dissolve. Looking then at a map again of the empire at its greatest extent, so you can see all the way into Egypt, up into the Scythians up here on the Black Sea and into Greece, and then all the way up into the Scythians of Central Asia. So these Scythians were those nomadic people that ran all along here, and we will be discussing them in the coming lectures. And for today, we're going to be focused on a singular city within the Achaemenid Empire, and that is Pasargadae. And this is one of those main huge sites that are incredibly interesting. And as you will see throughout this lecture, they definitely are very, very cool. So first, a question that we need to ask is, what is the relationship between the Achaemenids, as we know them, and the traditions of this larger Indo-Iranian kingship? So the Achaemenids, as they are Achaemenids, are not known in the epic tradition of the Iranians, that is the Avesta. In their inscriptions, and we have quite a few inscriptions, there are very few references to the Iranian / Zoroastrian gods, and that is mainly Ahura Mazda. So as those gods that I talked about in the last lecture, when we were speaking about Zoroastrianism, there aren't a lot of references to them. However, there are some parallels, especially in the theme of things. So the idea of ruling over great lands, this idea of the Aryan expanse, are evident in the language of the inscriptions. So we do see a parallel between Old Persian inscriptions and what we're seeing in Old Avestan. And if you remember from the last lecture, that family tree of languages, that Old Avestan is part of a different tradition of language groups than Old Persian is. While they do meet at that Proto-Indo-Iranian area of languages, they do separate out into Western and Eastern Iranian. And of course, as we will definitely see, and as you may already see with this image here, their visual culture, the visual culture of the Achaemenids, is drawn from a vast array of Near Eastern royal traditions. And we'll get into some of those today, but in the coming lectures of the Achaemenids, we will definitely see how that comes to play. So some of the important sites that we're going to look at are Pasargadae, which is the one that we will be looking at today, a major palace and garden structure, Ecbatana, which was taken over from the Medes, Susa, which we have seen before with the Elamites, which was also captured from the Median Empire, and Persepolis, this massive ceremonial palace that was built by Darius I and the following Achaemenid kings. And this is just a lovely site, and I think you'll fall in love with it just as much as I have, because you can see that I am here. I'm at the gate of all nations. The two bulls standing behind me, the Lamassu that we're so familiar with, are part of Persepolis. And of course, Naqsh Rustam, which you will see an image of today. And these are some huge tombs, and it has an incredibly long tradition of royal inscriptions, rock reliefs that are there, especially when you get to the Sasanian period. And of course, Babylon, we'll speak a little bit about Babylon because Cyrus has quite the connection with Babylon. And Bisotun, which is this huge rock relief and is what you saw at the very beginning, that first image that you saw is the rock relief at Bizertun of Darius I. So looking to Cyrus, his Old Persian name, Kurush, and when he founded the Achaemenid Empire, essentially as what it is, from 559 to 539, it came with a massive expansion of land. So he overthrows the Median Empire and the Neo-Babylonian Empire and takes over all of the territory that they once held. And the first actual evidence of Iranian archaeology and art appears with this time. As we discussed in the last lecture, the Median art and architecture, again, the Medians were an Iranian people. The Medians, they did not really, we have almost no archaeological or artistic evidence of their existence. And we see Cyrus, after he defeats the Median and the Babylonian empires, he moves from this title of the King of Anshan, like the Elamites, to the King of the Four Quarters. And of course, you can see the Four Quarters, just like what we saw with Darius's epitaph here. We have the Four Quarters from the Oxus to the Nile, from Greece over to India. Now, one of the most famous things about Cyrus is perhaps the Cyrus cylinder. This is a massive cylinder meant to act as like a cylinder seal, and it was found in a foundation deposit in the reconstructed walls of Babylon, of which Cyrus rebuilt. And the text, the way that the text is written, tells us that it was probably written by priests of Marduk in a very classicizing style, giving a historical authority to Cyrus's actions. And as you can see here in the red, it is an idea of divine kingship, that Marduk appointed Cyrus himself to rule over the entire world. And one of the things that you'll come across if you look up the Cyrus cylinder is that it has this idea that it was the first human rights document in the world. And while it does say that Cyrus allowed people to return to their homeland, what you see with this idea of the first human rights document is largely made up. It's based on an erroneous translation, and it really has been used as this propaganda tool. So definitely be careful with that. Now, we have evidence for Cyrus the person, just beyond that of what we've seen just on the Cyrus cylinder itself. And so we have here in the book of Isaiah and the book of Ezra evidence for Cyrus, king of Persia. And what's really fascinating is that in the book of Ezra, the Lord stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia. And just as Marduk, he sought and looked through all the lands and searched for this king. So we have a similar narrative that made its way into the Bible. So the Old Testament itself has a similar narrative structure. And you may be saying, well, oh, that's very interesting. When we talked about the Zoroastrians in the last lecture, there was a lot of very similar things going on there with the idea of a prophet coming and the resurrection of the soul. Well, yes, there is. And there has been a lot of research on the connection between the beliefs of Zoroastrianism and the beliefs of the Judeo-Christian religion, so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So we have, we know that this the Cyrus cylinder was found in the walls of Babylon, and we have a really interesting thing is that the Cyrus cylinder switches from a third-person narrative at the start, and it moves into a first-person narrative, so of Cyrus speaking himself. And here it says that he took up his residence in the royal palace, and with joy and rejoicing, Marduk Marduk made the residents of Babylon happy. Now, this is incredibly interesting because if you remember when I talked about the southern palace of Babylon, I said that only this portion of it dated to the reign of the Neo-Babylonian kings. And what we actually see here is that this black is archaeologically attested to have been added and renovated under Cyrus the Great. So he actually added bits to the palace himself. And the light gray here was added under Darius the First. And this here, this small little palace, is called the Petersierbau, the Persian building by the German excavators, was added under Artaxerxes II. So we have a long continued investment in Babylon by the Achaemenid kings. Now we also see that, as the texts say here, the gods who resided in them, being the sanctuaries, I brought back to their places and caused them to dwell in a residence for all time. And we have attestation, my apologies, of a great renovation of multiple temple structures throughout the lands that the Achaemenids controlled. So here we have kind of this dual evidence, is that we have the archaeological evidence of the Achaemenids rebuilding sanctuaries of these multiple gods, and we have textual evidence from the Cyrus cylinder itself. So moving to one of the most fascinating sites, and I apologize, I thought I took all of the black squares off, but I guess I forgot to. Those are just to make it so I know not to put anything there where the video is. So I guess you get a little look behind the scenes. But the site of Pasargadae, perhaps as Pathragada in Old Persian, but it is definitely attested as Batrakatash in the Persepolis fortification tablets, of which we will discuss in the next lecture. Now, according to Strabo, an ancient Greek historian, and the Nabonidus Chronicle, a sort of pseudo-epigraphal chronicle, the site of Pasargadae marks Cyrus's victory over the Median king. And Cyrus was purportedly buried here. So here we're looking at Pasargadae. This is Persepolis, that other major site, and you can see Susa right up here. Now, the site of Pasargadae is this large, sprawling estate/complex that is situated in a valley that's deep in the Zagros Mountains of the Parsa province, modern Fars province, Iran. And it was organized, the buildings and the structures and the garden itself was organized specifically to have perfected views of different features. And it was ordered around these intersecting sight lines, which were designed to highlight the garden form. And as you can see how you have Palace S here looking across this way, Pavilion A looking down this large open space, and Palace P having the main view through this garden area. And what we're looking at is this is the larger structure of the Pasargadae complex, and we're looking at, so this site plan here is this area here. And what's really fascinating about the site is that the principal architectural element is the columned hall and porch. So different from what we saw at Babylon and those other sites, so the Assyrian cities, where it was the idea of the courtyard surrounded by rooms. Instead, we're getting a new form of architecture that is linked to prestige, and that is the columned hall, that hypostyle hall. And it was meant to mimic those orderly groves of trees that were located around the site. And of course, we could compare this to the hypostyle hall at Karnak. We have this similar sort of structure as to these grand spaces. So looking then a little bit at a satellite image, we have a gatehouse, two palaces. We have Palace P and Palace S, which are located on the garden structure, right around this garden structure. And it was surrounded by canals, not walls. So there's evidence of only one singular wall at the site, and this has to do with something completely different, and is not a royal structure. But instead of kind of walls, it's this natural border. So these natural canals that flow around the site. And what we see in the architecture is a fusion of styles from everywhere in the empire. So all the way from Greece, from Babylon, from the Assyrian states, from all over the empire, we're seeing all of these styles come together at a singular place. So perhaps you could think about it as when we discussed the Assyrian palace, in which all of the wood of all of the empire was brought to the palace. We have a similar type of thing going on here, where the architectural styles of all over the empire were brought to a single place. So this site was called a paradise. And I guess this could be your fun fact for the day, so you can go home and tell your friends. But the word paradise, as we have it in English, descends directly from Old Persian paradaida, and it was attested in Artaxerxes II's inscription at the Chowder Palace at Susa as Paradida. In Elamite, we have it as Partetash, and in the Avestan, we have Paradisa. So it's what we have here is that the Achaemenid notion of the paradise has to do with this idea of this perfected place. And we'll talk a little bit more about this idea of the perfected world in a little bit. Now, as you can see through all of these red text here, we have a sacred area, which has this really interesting structure, and we'll talk about that in a bit. We have this fortified sector, and that again is that's that only wall that I mentioned. This Tale Tocht, which is this large kind of citadel type structure. The Zendane Soleiman, which is this really enigmatic structure. This section here that we've seen before, and of course the tomb of Cyrus, which is located outside of this general highly invested area. Now here is a view coming from the Tale Tocht, and you can see here, this is just the edge of the Tale Tocht here. The Zendane Soleiman is here. The tomb is way off in the distance back there. Palace S is just barely visible. You can see the columns of it, and Palace P, you can see the outline of it here. So it's an absolutely beautiful site. And as you'll see in a couple of these images, when the rains come, it's just verdant and beautifully green. And as you can imagine, with those irrigation canals that run throughout the site, it would be green year-round by pulling water from the river. And you can see the mountains off in the background there. So looking at our first structure is this so-called gatehouse R. Now you're going to see we have R, S, and P, and those were just designations by the excavators. So there is no real meaning to them other than just as a designation, but this is what we call them, so I guess this is just what we do. So we have one of the most kind of absolutely amazing things here, and that is that we see a divorced gatehouse. The gatehouse is no longer connected to the palace structures. So like we saw at Babylon, how the Ishtar Gate was intimately associated with the palace. At Hattusha, how the gates into the palace were the most important part. Here, the gatehouse is just off on its lonesome. And again, we don't have walls at the site. So essentially, anyone could kind of walk in, and there is no kind of defensible structure. And that really has to do with this idea that it is a perfected world. So I want you to remember this, is that what we're seeing here is that this gatehouse is this is very much a manifestation of this perfected world without evil. So there is no need to have these fortification walls. Now, located on one of the door jambs in this gatehouse is this absolutely lovely winged genius here. And those of you who have been paying attention to our Egyptian side, you may notice something very, very similar. But this winged genius definitely calls to mind some of those protective deities like the Lamassu, or even those Assyrian deities of which we saw before, as to where we have this kind of supernatural being that is there to protect those on the inside. And in fact, when we compare it with some of these other things, so this Assyrian winged genie that we've seen before, you can see that we have this idea of the four wings, that double winged creature. You'll even notice that the robe is incredibly similar. You can still just barely make out the hem of the robe here is very much drawing on this Neo-Assyrian precedent. But you'll also notice that the headdress is this so-called hem crown. It is also known as the triple ATEF crown, and this is drawn directly from Egypt. So it's absolutely incredible that we're seeing this fusion of Assyrian deities with this Egyptian crown. And of course, we also have this idea from Elam of these flat backed robes here. So we're seeing a fusion both of the Assyrian, this Neo-Assyrian robe style with this hem coming up like this, as well as the Islamite flat bottom here. And you'll notice that the feet are just barely sticking out and they are barefoot. So it may even be that this barefoot nature is drawing on the sacredness that we saw with perhaps the Akkadian reliefs, or even going back to Egypt itself and how being barefoot is a sacred act. So I spoke a little bit about these water channels, and you'll see the actual archaeological evidence for them here. And those are seen as these black lines and black squares that run all throughout this central garden area. And each of these kind of hollow squares are these open basins where the water would kind of tumble into, and you would have this beautiful kind of running water sound throughout the entire garden. You can imagine it would be very peaceful. So here then is just a close-up satellite view, and generally speaking, Pasargadae is thought of as basically the first rendition of this so-called Chahar Bagh, or four garden in New Persian. And you can see that that is relatively close to the case, is that we only have evidence right now for these two main structures with the water channels. One could see how we have also these paths splitting it. So there is definitely a longer tradition of these garden forms that stems all the way back to the Achaemenid Empire. So looking at these geophysical results from Bouchara and Benech, who in the 1990s and early 2000s did a magnetometry survey of most of the site of Pasargadae, you can see that we have remnants of a lot of structures that were never known before. So we have some type of structure here. You can see the extent of these water channels. So we have even more water channels running along this way. We have a whole bunch of information that was basically previously unknown to us, thanks to these idea of this scientific aspect of archaeology. So magnetometry is really something that's absolutely fascinating. So I said that we would talk a bit more about this idea of the paradise, and it is represented in Hebrew as Pardes, Akkadian Pardesu, Armenian Partes, And you get the rest paradisos, where we get Latin paradisus, and we get English paradise from. And this design of the garden structure is indicative of the larger tradition of paradise estates in the Achaemenid Empire. Now, the paradise reflects the perfected world after the Zoroastrian renovation, this post-apocalyptic perfected world. The paradise for the Achaemenids was an area of supreme order and beauty. Hence, the organized channels, these perfected views, these groves of trees, and these ideas of those perfect sight lines that are intersecting. So the Zoroastrians were expected to cleanse the earth of evil. That was their job. And we actually have texts from the Sasanian period talking about how they were meant to kill noxious creatures like snakes and scorpions. And that was part of them renovating the earth and getting rid of the evil. So thus, the creation of a paradise on earth was theologically justified. They were getting rid of evil structures, so dry land, and making it good and wholesome. It connects the patron both to that primordial perfected earth and to that post-renovation perfected earth. So as I mentioned in the previous class about this idea of the fixed time, the patron here, so Cyrus the Great, was connecting his own time both to that perfected past and that perfected future. And he was drawing the link between those two times. So looking then a little bit more at some of the language, this idea of thrasha, wonder, refers both to the post-apocalyptic world and to palaces. So it's a term used both to refer to this idea of the wondrous afterworld and to wondrous palaces. So the palace itself, just like the garden institution, replicates that post-apocalyptic perfected world. So then to see Palace S, so one of these palaces, it is a central hypostyle hall design with these 4 cardinally oriented porches. And as you can see by some of these pictures, that it was constructed of this finely wrought masonry, indicative of a superior craftsmanship, of a craftsmanship that really was meant to put a significant amount of time into constructing this perfected palace, as to where the lines had to be just perfectly straight, the circles perfectly circular. Everything was meant to be a manifestation of this perfected paradisical world. So seeing it, another view of the hypostyle hall, the various door jambs, the entrances into the structure, were covered in low-relief sculptures of humans, divine figures, and composite creatures. So just like we saw at the gatehouse and with that genius, we're seeing as well in the palaces. And just notice how smoothly polished all of the stone elements are here. You can really see the amount of time and labor that went into constructing this beautifully organized and perfected space. One particular composite creature located on the door jamb is this half fish man, half bull. So as you can see here with this Neo-Assyrian plaque of Oannes, who is the god of wisdom, one of the gods of wisdom, it's this sort of fish man composite creature, as to where he's part fish but still has his feet, and then of course the bull in the back. And this had much the same function as the Lamassu of the Assyrians. However, it fuses these different elements. So we have the Babylonian bull of Marduk, or not the bull of Marduk, the bull of Adad, and the Assyrian god, so Oannes. And you can really see the interest in musculature and detail that is expressed in a manner similar to what we saw with the Akkadians, as to where you can even see that they're replicating the kneecap and all the folds of a kneecap and the sinewy legs of a bull, and you can even see the little individual hairs of the bull's tail. So within the hypostyle hall and porches, the column bases draw heavily on Ionian, which is a Greek tribe, on Ionian precedent and style. We have a horizontally fluted, so these are the flutes themselves, torus base with a sort of ogival fillet leading into a shallow apophagy. And so we have this ogival fillet, this sort of chyma reversa fillet here, and this apophagy, which is that slendering, the necking down of a column. And those are very much drawing on what we see from the area of Ionia and the Ionians at this time period. And it really is a true indication of that far-reaching empire. The ability to bring in artisans and styles and forms from the far reaches of the empire. So as I mentioned previously about the bringing all of the wood to the same place, here we're having Cyrus bring all of these different styles and artisans to the same place to construct this truly unique structure. So located within Palace S is this inscription, which is purporting to be made by Cyrus. And it is in Old Persian cuneiform, and it says, "I, Cyrus the king, and Achaemenid." Now, the only problem that we have with this is that Old Persian cuneiform wasn't invented until the reign of Darius I. So after Cyrus was already dead, then the language was invented. So it was probably meant, this inscription here was probably meant to connect Darius I to Cyrus, even though Darius was an usurper to the throne and killed Cyrus's son Cambyses II. So it seems to be that we don't really have within the things that we know of Cyrus, he doesn't refer to himself as an Achaemenid. Instead, he refers to himself in some aspects as this Iranian. And what Darius is doing is he is trying to make Cyrus, the founder of the so-called Achaemenid Empire, as one of his own, as an Achaemenid. Moving then to Palace P, we have a relatively similar design to what we see at Palace S. However, this palace maintains that principal sightline into the garden. So this is the one that looks directly through that's the center of that garden space. And on the other side, it looks towards the citadel, that Tale Taht. And this was a much more intimate interior space. The columns are more closely placed together, and it has a second story, which was given to private apartments. So it is a much more kind of residential quarter versus what we saw with Palace S, which was much more open and airy and perhaps meant for some sort of ceremony or relation to the throne room. As you can see on the doorway reliefs, just like we saw at Palace S and the gateway, we have a very similar use of structure. This time we have these little boots, these little sandals, they're super cute, and this robe that is very much beholden to the Achaemenid tradition. And we'll see this style of robe occur time and time again. And this is very much can be thought of as that Achaemenid robe. So then looking again at some of these inscriptions which were brought in, we have another example of this CMA, as it's known as I, Cyrus the King in Achaemenid. But we also have another inscription which occurs on the robes of one of those doorway figures. And it occurs right on the hem, as you can see here. And this one says Cyrus, the great king in Achaemenid. So again, we see Darius playing with this idea of connecting Cyrus to his own line. And really what we can think here is we can think on how the Assyrian reliefs also use text and image to portray a certain narrative. So we may be seeing a very similar thing here. And now you may be wondering what these holes along the hem of the robe are. And this was probably to attach some sort of plate, perhaps gold, or maybe an inlaid type thing to really accentuate the stone of the statue, give it a more three-dimensional, lively feel. So one thing that we definitely see here that really cements the idea that we have these Ionians coming into down to Pisargadai to work on the structure is this anatherosis technique. And essentially, this is an imported Ionian technique that is very common in Greek architecture. And it is used in dry stone construction, so construction without mortar, to create these perfectly orthogonal joints. So as you can see that the margins of the stone are worked with a fine claw-toothed chisel to produce a flat surface, and the interiors are worked roughly and chipped away below the baseline to make fitment easier and more precise. So as you can imagine, if you were an ancient stonemason trying to get these stones constructed in a short period of time, it's a lot easier to make two little strips parallel and flat than it is to make this massive surface flat. And you can see evidence here on this column of those little claw-toothed chisel marks. They're absolutely fascinating and really interesting. And it is definitely one of those very indicative marks of Greek craftsmanship being brought in to the Achaemenid Empire. Now, at this time, you may be thinking, as many people have before, that the Achaemenids weren't good at doing their own architecture. And that really isn't the case. As I mentioned before, this really is a way to show just the extent and the power of the Achaemenid Empire. By having the ability to take people all the way from Greece and bring them deep into the Zagros mountain range into southern Iran really shows the amount of power that is available to the king. We also see some more techniques. Here you can see that same idea with the chipping away, the anatherosis, and we also have these metal clamps, these swallowtail clamps that are made of iron to lock the blocks together. And the same thing happens with columns in which they have these large metal pegs that are placed into the column, and then the other drum is put on top of it. So we have these metal locks. And in fact, you'll see if you've ever been to Rome or any of the other places that the Romans have been, you'll see that there are holes chipped out. The Colosseum is especially famous for this, and that is because people come and loot the metal out of them. So we'll also see that a little bit later on as well. Moving then to the tomb of Cyrus, the great tomb of Cyrus. You'll notice that it is this pedimented structure and it's located off in the distance from the main garden area. It has this pediment, this gabled roof. It's up on this large stone base. And this is something, this form is something that we also see up into Anatolia at roughly the same time period. And this monument really is a one-off. We don't have any other examples of this type of tomb structure. So here you can just get a sense of scale of how absolutely massive it is and just how finely wrought the stone masonry is, this ashlar masonry. And I also thought that this was kind of a cool image with the Milky Way in the background, kind of neat. So it had a comparatively, a very small interior. And if what we know of later burial practice is kind of what was happening at this time, it probably only held this small ostodon with the bones of Cyrus, so a small little urn that had Cyrus's bones in it. They didn't do cremation, even if he was buried in the structure. Now, Greek sources report from after the time of Alexander that the interior had this golden table with a royal purple cloth, and that was contained inside of it. And this is important to remember in a little bit, so definitely remember that. Here we have from Arrian's Anabasis, where it has the grave of Cyrus was in the royal preserve at Pasargadae, and around it there flourished a grove with every sort of tree, and it was irrigated with water. So that really kind of gives us a more ancient source about how this was very much this garden perfected space. We also have in Plutarch, in his Life of Artaxerxes, we have the information that there was a royal initiation ceremony here. So similar to, in a way, to the Akitu festival of the Neo-Babylonians. Here, the king, the Achaemenid king, would take off his robes and put on the actual robe of Cyrus, and that's how they would become king. And this is also a chance to show a very fanciful reconstruction. It's absolutely beautiful. And these are just some fun images for the exam, so just for your perusal to be able to recognize them. The next area that we're going to look at is this so-called sacred precinct. This is just off in the wild. It's, as you can see, we have the Tali Talked here, that royal kind of precinct, and this is off on the other side of the river. I accidentally put sacred area in the wrong place. My apologies, because this is a river here, so I will fix that before I upload these, but the sacred precinct was off in this area. And as you can see, it is this kind of walled structure, this open courtyard, so large I don't even know if you could call it courtyard, with these two very enigmatic structures in it. And then there's also this very interesting platform here. When we look at an aerial photo, you can see it a bit better. We have those two structures, which are represented by this image here. We have a stepped platform up to this large thing, and this platform in which there are no steps. And then there is this very odd, enigmatic structure. We don't really have any idea of what it was used for. So looking at the magnetometry results, you can see that perhaps it held structures on top of it. We have a couple of different areas reminiscent of terracing. Sorry, there's just a really cute golden retriever that walked by. Golden retrievers are my favorite dog, and I had to look at it. So anyway, we have this some sort of terraced structure here, and you can see the where those two odd, very enigmatic structures, these here, and we really don't know exactly what they were used for. However, we can make a very educated guess. This tomb relief from Naqsh Rustam shows a king on a platform with another flat platform in which a fire altar with a burning fire is located. And they are awfully similar to what we see at Pasargadae. So it may be that this is a representation of the fire cult, so that main precept of Zoroastrianism, that worship of fire. And what's really fascinating here is that this may be the only evidence we have of Achaemenid era religious structures. There is one other site known as Dahane-Goleman, located on the border with Afghanistan in Iran. And we will talk about that maybe a little bit, not incredibly relevant. But these open air sanctuaries are very different to what we see later on with the Sasanians, where we know most of our Zoroastrian practices from. And one of the things that has kind of plagued scholarship in the past 100 years is the idea that what we know of Zoroastrianism now from these later kind of 7th, 8th century CE sources can be retrojected into the past to the Achaemenids. And I mean, as we've seen with kind of the development of language, why hasn't the development of religion also happened? So it's really difficult to kind of parse through the scholarly literature and talk about these structures as their own structures that reflect a different type of Zoroastrianism. And this kind of comes again to that idea of a nationalistic discourse. In the early part of the centuries of the 19th and 20th century, what we saw is this idea of a sort of Zoroastrian nationalism start to appear. And what I mean by that is that they wanted to retroject their current practices into the deep past to kind of use what they were doing at this very moment to be the exact same as what was happening during the Achaemenid era. And this was kind of a way for them to show that they were these kind of the oldest religion. They were older than any practices going on today. And that unfortunately has led a lot of very good scholars down a very bad and essentially wrong path. And what we have, the evidence that we have of the Achaemenid religion is very different from what we have of evidence for the Sasanian Zoroastrianism and later Zoroastrianism. So that's something that we should just really be aware of, is that as we're going through this, I may use the term Zoroastrianism to describe the religion of the Achaemenids and Zoroastrianism to describe the religion of the Sasanians, but they're not necessarily the same thing. Just as Catholicism of the 4th century CE is not the same as Catholicism today. And same with Islam, same with Judaism, same with Buddhism, all of that. They're not the same thing, but we still use that same term. So looking then to the Tale Tacht, one of the absolutely fabulous structures. It was this sort of semi-fortified structure constructed of this very fine ashlar masonry. Its purpose, of course, is not entirely known. However, the geophysical surveys that Bouchardal and Venech revealed to the north in this so-called fortified sector show a very densely packed industrial area. So perhaps this was some sort of administrative building, the Tale Tacht, for Achaemenid industrial production. And one of the other fascinating things is that a vast network of clay drain pipes were found throughout the structure, and they all led rainwater away from the interior down towards that river. And what exists today is only this light gray shaded part. So what you can see here, this is all that is left. The rest are just bare foundations in ruins. Here you can see a picture of the Tale Tacht. You can see that it rises above the plain, and you can imagine that with the rest of the structure, it would be quite an imposing sight. And this comes from kind of just the Zendane Suleiman is just off screen over here. Now, if we look a little bit closer, you can see, I mentioned that iron clamps being looted. You can see that people busted in to this lovely masonry. This chisel drafted margins is the style of masonry here. You can see how the face comes out and then it moves in to where the joint is. That's chisel drafted masonry. And it really shows it's a great representation of a unified masonry technique that's drawn from Ionian precedent. And you can really see how this would have been just a fabulously imposing and amazing structure, as it were, during the time of when it was when it was a full structure. So the next site that we're going to be looking at is the so-called Zindan-e-Soleiman, which is Persian for the prison of Suleiman, or Solomon, so the Solomon of the Bible. And of course, its purpose is entirely unknown. It's made of this finely dressed stone with the anathyrosis technique, as we talked about before. The central door, so right here, the central door jamb features this recess in it that once it was shut, it could not be opened again. We have this dental frieze here, these little teeth that draws heavily on Ionian precedent, while the structure itself is very much so unique. This tower-like structure exists in only 2 other places in the Achaemenid Empire, and we really don't know what they were used for. The geophysical survey, again by Bouchardot and Benech, has this very interesting structure located directly behind. So you can see here's the site plan of the Zindan-e-Soleiman, and here is this structure here. And you can notice that you have these kind of horizontal striations, so the differentiation between this dark and the light, and that is indicative of the foundations for a hypostyle hall, as to where you have these packed earth and then loose gravel in between, as to where the pillars would then sit onto that packed earth. So we may have the remnants of another hypostyle hall located directly behind this Zindan-e-Soleiman. So another view of the site is here, and you can see that we have the remnants of a massive staircase. And again, we really don't know what it is used for. So it's just this absolutely enigmatic structure. Some people have put forth that this is some sort of fire shrine, but then archaeological survey of a more intact one at Naqsh-e-Rustam has shown that there isn't enough airflow in order to be able to sustain a fire, and there would be evidence of smoke damage on the walls of the structure. So there also has been theories that this was used to store the sacred texts of the Zoroastrians, the Avesta. So it's thought that perhaps these were put in here and the door closed, never to be opened again, in order for the text to be able to be preserved for eternity. Again, we don't know that, because unfortunately the one that was in a better state of preservation at Naqsh-e-Rustam was basically, the door was busted open and it was looted. Again, you can see this lovely reconstruction from Persepolis 3D. We will be seeing more from this website later on, but definitely take a check at it if you have the chance, because it is absolutely fabulous. And here are some site plans. These are from David Stronach, one of the great archaeologists from UCLA. And you can see that there is this lovely cavetto-type cornice, very similar to what we've seen at Egypt. And this is something that is very much a feature that is brought into the Achaemenid architectural style, that may in fact be taken directly from Egypt. And this is a very good view, as you can see, with the stairs leading up to it, and these fake false windows, as you can see here, these large stepped false windows with these really interesting, enigmatic, small, kind of rectangular indents. And it really is, this is really one of the most fascinating and entirely just unknown structures of the Achaemenid Empire. It would be really, you would win some sort of prize, the Nobel Prize or the Field Medal, if you were to figure out what the structure was for, is kind of how important understanding the structure is for understanding the Achaemenid state. So finally, we'll end a little bit early today so you can have some more time to study for the exam and enjoy your weekend. This is just the ground plan of the Zendane Suleiman, fully reconstructed, of course. So this concludes today's lecture, and we ended a little bit early. I was a little worried that was going to go over, but thankfully it didn't. So for next week, we're going to get into the time of Darius I and the Achaemenids. We'll also be looking at the Scythians, those amazing steppe nomads with their beautiful gold jewelry. And again, make sure that you start studying for the exam. There will be the discussion for 10.2 posted down below. Again, thank you so much for all of your replies onto that discussion. It's so awesome to see. I'm so absolutely just stoked to see you guys participating in that. So thank you again. So yeah, make sure you take a check at the study guide. If you have any questions on that, don't hesitate to contact me. Next week, we have the Achaemenids coming up, more of the Achaemenids, the Darius and later Achaemenids, and Persepolis, Gate of All Lands. And we will be getting closer to the paper being due. So if you have any questions about that, don't hesitate to drop into office hours. Nina has office hours after this, so don't hesitate to go and talk with her about your paper, or talk with me about the paper. Shoot me an email, come to my office hours. So have a good time, stay safe, and enjoy the rest of your day. All right, bye-bye.